Believing the only monsters behind bars are the ones made of flesh and bone is the most dangerous illusion you can entertain. The cold iron and weeping stone of a prison are not just walls to hold men. They are a battery, a capacitor for human despair, for violent echoes that stain the very air like dried blood on concrete. I have seen the shadows these places birth, shadows that cling to the living, that feed on fear and regret. They don't care about sentences or parole. They are serving an eternity, and they are always looking for new cellmates. The real horror isn't getting in. It's what you might take with you when you leave. A darkness that follows you home. A whisper that never fades from the back of your mind. You must understand, these structures are more than just buildings. They are modern-day tombs, built on foundations of misery. Every shout of rage, every silent tear, every final, desperate breath is absorbed by the porous concrete. The energy doesn't dissipate. It congeals, it ferments in the darkness, growing thick and sentient, like mold on a forgotten sacrament. It creates an atmosphere so heavy you can feel it pressing on your chest, a spiritual pressure that seeks to crack the sanity of anyone who stays too long. It is an echo chamber of suffering, where the worst moments of 1,000 lives are played on a loop, just beneath the threshold of hearing, waiting for a mind fragile enough to tune in to their dreadful frequency. We will begin our descent in a place the records have tried to forget, a penitentiary known in hushed whispers as the Jaw. It wasn't its official name, of course, but the inmates called it that because it was a place that chewed men up and spit out something less, something broken. The oldest wing, Block C, was decommissioned decades ago, not because it was structurally unsound, but because the guards refused to walk its halls after sundown. They spoke of a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, a cold that felt like a hand on the back of the neck. They spoke of the doors to empty cells creaking open, slowly, as if pushed by an unseen patient hand. The story of the Jaw is anchored to a single cell, number 47, placed so foul that even the rats seem to avoid it. Its last official occupant was a man named Silas, a quiet prisoner who one night did something impossible. The guards found him in the morning, his body contorted into a shape that defied anatomy, his face frozen in a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. But that wasn't the impossible part. Scrawled on the wall behind him, in his own dried blood, were words in a language no one could identify, a language that seemed to writhe and twist before the eyes, ancient and forbidden. The cell was sealed, but the whispers had already begun. Listen carefully, because this is crucial. The official report claimed Silas took his own life in a fit of psychosis, a neat, tidy explanation that swept the horror under the rug. But the inmates knew the truth. They had heard the sounds from his cell the night he died. It wasn't the sound of a man in distress. It was the sound of a conversation. One voice, Silas's, pleading and frantic, and another, a guttural, wet sound, like something trying to form words with a throat full of cold ash and grave dirt. They said whatever was in that cell with him didn't kill him. It showed him something from beyond the cracked mirror of reality. A truth so monstrous, it simply shattered his soul. Years later, during a period of severe overcrowding, the warden was forced to reopen Block C. A young inmate, a first-timer named Leo, was assigned to the infamous cell 47. The older prisoners tried to warn him, speaking in low tones about the breathing wall and the man of ash. Leo, a product of a world that fears nothing it can't see, laughed it off as prison folklore. Ghost stories meant to scare the new fish. He stepped into the cell, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a sound like a final judgment, and felt the first touch of that unnatural cold. He told himself it was just a draft, just the age of the building settling into his bones. The first night was an exercise in denial. Leo lay on his cot, listening to the symphony of the prison, the coughing, the distant shouts, the weeping of broken men. But underneath it all, a new sound began to surface, a faint, rhythmic scratching from within the walls. It sounded like a rat at first, but it had a strange intelligence to it. It would scratch 3 times, pause, then scratch 3 times again, a morbid mockery of a knock on a door. He tried to ignore it, pulling his thin blanket over his head, but the sound seemed to bypass his ears and burrow directly into his skull, a chilling, persistent intrusion into his thoughts. By the 3rd night, the scratching was joined by a whisper. It was so faint he thought he was imagining it, the sound of wind through a crack in the stone. But it began to form words, syllables of a language he didn't know yet somehow understood. It wasn't a language of the tongue, but a language of pure emotion, of pure dread. The whispers spoke of endless falling, of doors that open into nothingness, of being forgotten by light itself. They were the cold ashes of forgotten prayers, the last testament of 1,000 damned souls, and they were all calling to him from the darkness inside the stone. Now imagine this. You are locked in a box of concrete and steel. There is no escape. The only company you have is a voice that promises you secrets of what lies beyond the final, rattling breath. This is the temptation that the entity in cell 47, it preys not just on fear, but on the desperate, gnawing curiosity of a man with nothing left to lose. Leo found himself listening, straining to hear more. The whispers started to tell him about the other inmates, their secret fears, the crimes they really committed. It made him feel powerful, privy to the darkness in other men's hearts, not realizing that this knowledge was a hook, pulling him deeper into its own abyss. The change in Leo was palpable. The guards noted his decline in their logs. His eyes, once defiant, became hollow, like cracked mirrors, reflecting a perpetual twilight. He stopped eating. He would spend hours staring at the wall where Silas had left his bloody message, a message that had been scrubbed away, but whose psychic stain remained. He would trace the faint outlines with his finger, muttering to himself. The other inmates gave him a wide berth. They could see the shadow clinging to him, a visible aura of despair that seemed to suck the warmth from the air around him. He was no longer just an inmate. He was becoming an extension of the cell's own malevolence. What the stars don't tell you openly is that some places are wounds on the face of the world. They are psychic sores that never heal, and anything that dwells within them becomes infected. The jaw was such a place. It was a nexus of negative energy, and cell 47 was its festering heart. The entity within wasn't the ghost of a single man. It was an amalgamation, a composite horror born from every act of violence, every moment of utter hopelessness that had ever occurred within those walls. It was the spirit of the prison itself, a hungry, conscious darkness that had found a voice in the whispers from the stone. Leo's final night came a week after his arrival. The entire cell block fell into a dead silence around midnight. No coughing, no shouts, no weeping, just an oppressive, listening quiet. Then, a single blood-curdling scream erupted from cell 47. It was a sound of pure soul-shredding agony that went on, far longer than a man's lungs should allow. When the guards finally forced the jammed door open, they found the cell empty. The iron-barred window was secure. The door had been locked from the outside. Leo was simply gone. All that remained was a single fresh word scrawled in blood on the wall. The name Silas. The cycle was complete. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? This story serves as a chilling reminder that the punishments of man are temporary. There are older, more permanent judgments. The walls of these places are not impartial observers. They are active participants in the torment they house. They are monuments to human cruelty, and they develop a cruel intelligence of their own. They learn from their inhabitants. They learn how to break a mind, how to peel back the layers of sanity until only the raw screaming nerve of terror is left. Every soul that joins this darkness with us feeds the voice that whispers these truths. So subscribe and let the shadows know you are listening. Let us now travel to another monument of despair, a place nestled in a fog-choked swampland known as the Pelican Bay Correctional Facility. This isn't a tale of a single haunted cell, but of an entire yard, the exercise yard for the most dangerous inmates. It was a bleak expanse of cracked concrete, surrounded by razor wire, a place where the sky itself seemed like a lid on a coffin. The horror here wasn't a constant presence, but an event, an omen. The inmates called it the silent hour, and it was always preceded by the arrival of a single, unnaturally large crow that would perch atop the highest guard tower, watching. The first time it happened, no one understood the significance. The crow landed, its feathers the color of a starless midnight, its eyes like chips of obsidian. A moment later, a profound silence fell over the yard. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a heavy silence, a physical weight that muted everything. The shouting, the clanging of weights, the rhythmic thud of a basketball, all of it ceased at once. Men would stop mid-sentence, their words dying in their throats. They would look around, a primal fear dawning in their eyes, as if the world had suddenly been put on pause. The air grew still and cold, and this is where everything changes for you. During this silent hour, which never lasted more than a few minutes, the inmates would become statues. They were conscious, their eyes wide with panic, but they were utterly unable to move or speak, trapped inside their own bodies, forced to witness the absolute stillness of their world. The only thing that moved was the crow, which would turn its head, its gaze sweeping over the frozen men below, as if it were taking inventory, as if it were choosing. When the silence finally broke, it shattered like glass, and the noise of the yard would rush back in, frantic and terrified. But the truth is, someone was always different afterward. After the first silent hour, a notorious gang leader, a man feared for his explosive violence, was found weeping uncontrollably, reduced to a terrified child. He could only speak of the man with the sackcloth face who had walked among them during the silence, a figure only he could see. After the second incident, another inmate, a hardened killer, gouged out his own eyes, screaming about the writing on the inside of his skull. The crow was not just an observer, it was a herald. Its arrival signaled that something was about to be taken from one of the men, their sanity, their will to live, or their very soul. The guards, of course, dismissed it as mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon born from the high-stress environment. But a few of the older officers, men who had seen too much to believe in simple explanations, knew better. One of them, a man named Russo, who was near retirement, started keeping a secret log. He noted the dates of the crow's appearances and the subsequent breakdowns. He saw the pattern. The crow was like a psychopomp, a guide for souls, but it wasn't guiding them to the afterlife. It was guiding something from the other side to them. It was opening a creaking door between worlds, right there in the middle of the prison yard. Rousseau's journal spoke of the air during the silent hour. He described it as feeling thin, as if the barrier between our reality and another, much older one, was wearing away. He wrote that on one occasion, he thought he saw the heat haze shimmering over the concrete form, a shape, a tall, stooped figure moving through the paralyzed inmates, pausing to lean close to one, as if whispering a secret in his ear. The inmate it paused by was the one who, hours later, calmly walked to the fence and didn't stop, letting the automated systems riddle his body with bullets. He died with a serene, knowing smile on his face. What the occult texts whisper about such things is that certain animals are keys. They are conduits, living bridges between the world of the seen and the unseen. Crows in particular have always been associated with prophecy, with secrets, and with death. This was no ordinary bird. It was a focal point, a living symbol of doom that drew its power from the concentrated misery of Pelican Bay. It was a symbiotic entity, feeding on the fear it created, and in return, it offered glimpses of a reality so terrifying that it shattered the human mind. The prison wasn't just its hunting ground, it was its temple. The fear of the crow became more potent than the fear of any rival gang or solitary confinement. When its dark shape appeared against the gray sky, a wave of pure terror would wash over the yard. Men would try to run, to get back inside, but the silence would always fall before they could reach the doors, freezing them in their tracks. It became a twisted, recurring nightmare from which there was no waking, a lesson in absolute helplessness. The entity it served understood the core of the criminal mind. To a man who prides himself on control and power, the most terrifying punishment is to have it all stripped away in an instant. The last entry in Rousseau's journal is almost illegible, his handwriting a frantic scroll. He wrote that during the most recent silent hour, the crow hadn't looked at the inmates. It had been perched on the tower, staring directly into the observation window where he stood. Rousseau felt its gaze like two sharp, cold needles piercing his mind. He wrote that he could hear a voice, not in his ears, but inside his head, a voice like grinding stones. It was telling him that it knew he was watching. It told him that his logbook was a map, and that it would follow that map home. Rousseau took his own life that night. The journal was found under his mattress. This tale is a dire warning. Do not mistake folklore for fiction. Omens are real. They are the universe's way of showing you the cracks in the world, the places where the darkness is leaking through. The crow of Pelican Bay was more than a bird. It was a signature, a calling card for a power that delighted in mental and spiritual vivisection. It taught the inmates that there are sentences far longer than life, and cells far smaller than a concrete box. The smallest cell, the most inescapable, is your own mind. When it has been invaded by a horror it cannot comprehend, every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Now let us descend even deeper into the most feared corner of any penitentiary, solitary confinement, a place designed to break a person with nothing but silence and their own reflection. We go to the now abandoned Rockwood Asylum, a place that housed the criminally insane. In its basement was a row of cells known as the pits. There were no windows, no lights, just a steel slab for a bed and a polished steel plate on the wall that served as a crude mirror. The inmates here weren't sent for punishment, but for observation when their madness took a particularly creative turn. It was here that the legend of the cracked mirror began. The story centers on an inmate known only as Patient 82, a man who had murdered his family, claiming their faces had been replaced by the faces of strangers made of smoke. In the absolute isolation of the pits, his only companion was his own reflection in the steel plate. At first, he used it to maintain a grip on his identity, to remind himself of his own face, but the profound sensory deprivation began to warp his perceptions. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own blood flowing, his own heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate prisoner. His reflection began to feel separate. After the first week, he reported to the orderlies that his reflection was no longer mimicking him correctly. There was a delay, a fraction of a second, but it was there. He would raise his hand, and the man in the mirror would raise his a moment later. The doctors called it the Troxler effect, a form of sensory fading, but patient 82 insisted it was something more. He claimed a reflection had started smiling when he was not, a slow, cruel smile that didn't reach its eyes. Its eyes, he said, were becoming darker, the pupils dilating until they were just black, empty pools. And this is where the terror truly begins to seep in. Isolation doesn't just starve the senses, it opens doors in the mind that are meant to remain sealed. The polished steel plate was not a magical artifact, it was a canvas. Patient 82's tormented psyche, amplified by the suffocating silence and darkness, was projecting his inner demons onto the only surface available. The entity in the mirror was a manifestation of his own guilt, his own madness, given form. But what if it was the other way around? What if the isolation didn't create the entity, but merely made him able to finally see what was always there, riding along with him? He started having conversations with the reflection. At first he would speak, and it would just watch, its malevolent smile fixed in place. Then it began to answer, not with a voice he could hear, but with words that appeared in his mind, fully formed. The reflection told him that it was the real one, and he, the man of flesh and blood, was merely a pale, dying echo. It told him of a world on the other side of the steel, a world of perfect, silent darkness, and that it wanted to trade places. It whispered that the murders he committed were not his fault. It was the reflection that had reached through and guided his hands. The psychological logs from his therapy sessions are chilling. The doctors noted he had developed a complete schism of identity. He would refer to himself in the third person as the body, while referring to the man in the steel as his true self. He begged them to break the mirror, to remove it from his cell, but it was bolted to the wall. His terror grew, but so did a strange curiosity. The reflection started showing him things. In the dark surface of the steel, he saw visions, cities made of bone, oceans of tears, and skies filled with screaming, blind birds. It was showing him its home. The breaking point came on the 30th day. Patient 82 began screaming, a single, sustained shriek that didn't stop for hours. When the orderlies finally entered the cell, they found him huddled in the corner, his fingernails torn and bloody from trying to claw his way through the concrete wall. He was staring at the steel mirror, which now had a large spiderweb crack running through it, emanating from a single point of impact. On the floor in front of it lay a shattered tooth. He had tried to break the mirror with his own head. He was rocking back and forth, muttering one phrase over and over, "He's out, he's out." After that day, patient 82 was never the same. He became completely catatonic, unresponsive to any stimulus. He would not speak, eat, or even blink for hours on end. But the orderlies reported a strange new phenomenon. At night, they would hear movement from his cell, peeking through the slot. They would see him standing, his back to the door, facing the cracked mirror. He would be moving, but his movements were wrong, jerky, and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. Sometimes they swore they saw his reflection in the cracked surface, standing perfectly still, just watching the body dance. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Your reflection watches you every day. The lesson here is one of internal horror. The most terrifying prisons are not made of stone, but of skull. Solitary confinement is a key that can unlock the darkest parts of the human mind, letting loose things that were never meant to see the light of day. The reflection in the mirror is a powerful symbol. It is the part of ourselves we cannot escape, the silent witness to all our deeds. But what happens when that witness is no longer silent? What happens when it decides it no longer wants to simply watch? The story of Patient 82 is a warning that when you stare into the abyss, sometimes the abyss stares back with your own face. Let us shift our focus from a single man to a collective curse, an object that poisoned an entire cell block. In the notorious Folsom State Prison, a story is told not of a ghost, but of a deck of cards. Not just any deck, but a crude, handmade set, crafted from scraps of cardboard and inked with a mixture of soot and blood. They were known as the Sorrowful Aces. The deck was created by an old inmate named Jan, a practitioner of a dark rural folk magic who was serving a life sentence for a series of ritualistic crimes. He poured all of his bitter, malevolent energy into creating them. The cards were visually disturbing. The kings were depicted as skeletal figures, the queens as weeping wraiths, and the jacks as grinning, imp-like creatures. The ace of spades, in particular, was said to be drawn with Jean's own blood on the night of a new moon. Jean used the cards for fortune-telling, but his predictions were always dire. He never foretold wealth or love, only betrayal, madness, and violent death. He claimed the cards didn't predict the future, they assigned it. To play a game with the Sorrowful Aces was to gamble with your own fate, and the deck was a notorious cheater. When Jean died of a heart attack in his cell, his few possessions were distributed. A young, cocky inmate named Marco managed to get his hands on the deck, seeing it as a morbid curiosity, a piece of prison lore he could own. He and his cellmate, a man named Davis, started playing simple games of gin rummy. But from the first shuffle, something was wrong. The air in the cell grew thick and heavy. The cards themselves felt cold to the touch, unnaturally so, like stones pulled from a deep river, and the games became intense. A simple loss would feel like a profound personal failure, sparking flashes of irrational rage. And this is where the web of darkness expands. Marco, who had a reputation for being lucky, started losing. Every hand was a bust. Every drawer was a useless card. He became obsessed, playing late into the night, demanding one more game from an increasingly unnerving Davis. Davis, on the other hand, couldn't lose. His hands were always perfect, but his victories brought him no joy. His eyes grew sunken, and he began muttering in his sleep. He told Marco that he was having dreams of a skeletal king who would sit at the end of his bed, shuffling the cards and telling him all the ways his fellow inmates would die. The curse of the Sorrowful Aces began to spread beyond their cell. Marco, desperate to break his losing streak, wagered the cards in a game with a powerful gang member. He lost, the deck passed hands, and with it, the malevolence. The new owner was found hanging in his cell 2 days later, a single ace of spades tucked into his pocket. The deck was found on his table, neatly stacked. It was picked up by another inmate, and a week later, a brutal riot broke out in that cell block, seemingly over nothing. Men who had been allies for years turned on each other with homemade knives, their faces contorted with a mindless fury. The deck was always at the epicenter of the violence. What the ancient whispers tell us about such objects is that they are anchors. They are physical items imbued with such powerful intent that they become a focal point for dark energy, a gateway for a specific brand of chaos. Jun hadn't just made a deck of cards. He had created a self-perpetuating engine of despair. It was designed to amplify the worst human emotions: greed, paranoia, jealousy, and rage. It fed on the negative energy it created, growing stronger with each act of violence it inspired. The cards didn't just cause bad luck. They actively sought out and destroyed any semblance of hope or camaraderie around them. The guards eventually caught on. They couldn't prove anything, but they noticed that trouble always followed that specific, grimy deck of cards. They confiscated it multiple times, locking it in an evidence locker, but it would always reappear. An inmate on cleaning duty would find it on a shelf. A guard would discover it in a drawer he had just cleared. It seemed the deck had a will of its own, a desire to be in play, to continue its grim work. It was a catalyst for ruin, a plague that passed from hand to hand, leaving a trail of broken minds and bleeding bodies in its wake. The final chapter of the Sorrowful Aces came when the deck fell into the hands of the prison chaplain, a well-meaning man who believed he could cleanse the object through prayer. He took the deck to his small, quiet chapel, intending to burn it while reciting passages from the Bible. As he held the cards over a metal basin, he said he felt a wave of icy coldness emanate from them. The flame from his lighter would not catch. The cards refused to burn. He then heard a voice, a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to come from the cards themselves. It began to tell him his own secret sins, the dark thoughts he kept hidden, even from God. The chaplain fled the chapel in terror, leaving the cards behind. The next morning, the prison was on lockdown. The chapel had been desecrated, the cross was inverted, the pews were overturned, and the Bible had been torn to shreds. And in the center of the room, on the altar, the sorrowful aces were laid out in a complex, star-like pattern. The chaplain was found in his office, his mind completely gone, scribbling crude drawings of skeletal kings and weeping queens all over the walls. The deck of cards vanished after that day and has never been seen again. But the inmates say you can still feel its presence, a lingering chill of betrayal in the air. This is a stark illustration of how evil can be codified, given a physical form that allows it to persist long after its creator is gone. A curse is not just a whispered word, it is a piece of spiritual machinery, a program written with intent and powered by emotion. The Sorrowful Aces were a perfect machine for dismantling hope and trust, the two most valuable currencies in a place like a prison. It serves as a warning to be mindful of the objects you keep, of the history they might carry. Sometimes, the most innocent-looking trinket can be a door creaking open to let in a darkness you can never put back. Let's turn our gaze now to the figures of authority, for not all shadows are cast by the inmates. We journey to the Eastern State Penitentiary, a Gothic fortress of solitude and silence. Its most famous warden, a man named Alistair Finch, was known for his radical belief in penance through isolation. He designed the prison himself, a radial plan where he could stand in the center and watch all the cell blocks at once, like a spider in the middle of a web. He was a devoutly religious man, but his God was one of wrath and judgment, and Finch saw himself as its earthly instrument. Finch believed that through total silence and solitude, an inmate would be forced to confront his sins and turn to God, but his methods were extreme. Inmates were hooded whenever they were outside their cells, so they would never see another human face. Their only contact was with guards whose shoes were muffled, making them seem like silent phantoms. Finch's grand experiment in salvation quickly devolved into an experiment in psychological torture. The silence was not peaceful. It was a screaming void that drove men mad. The isolation did not lead to penance, but to profound soul-crushing despair. The legends say that Warden Finch, in his obsessive quest for control, began to dabble in things beyond scripture. He was said to conduct strange, private rituals in the central rotunda at night, beneath the eye of God, a single skylight in the ceiling. He was seen carrying old leather-bound books filled with symbols that were decidedly not Christian. He wasn't trying to save his prisoners' souls for heaven. He believed that by breaking their spirits, he could harvest them, that the concentrated despair of his prison could be used as a source of power, a tribute to the dark entity he had come to worship instead of God. And this is where the story turns. The prison itself began to change under his influence. It was no longer just a building. It was becoming a temple to his cruel ideology. The guards reported strange phenomena. They would see a tall, slender shadow pacing the halls, a figure they assumed was the warden, only to find Finch locked in his office moments later. They heard liturgical chanting in dead languages, echoing from empty cell blocks. The prisoners, in their isolation, began to draw the same symbol on their walls without ever having seen it. A broken, inverted cross entwined with a serpent. They were all having the same nightmare. Finch's undoing came from his own hubris. During a particularly violent thunderstorm, he was performing one of his rituals in the rotunda. A massive bolt of lightning struck the central tower, traveling down the metal frame and into the very spot where he stood. The guards who rushed in found only a circle of cold ashes on the floor and the lingering smell of sulfur and ozone. Warden Alistair Finch was gone. His office was empty. His strange books vanished. The official cause of death was listed as a lightning strike, a freak accident, but the prison knew better. He hadn't been struck down. He had been collected. After his disappearance, the true haunting of Eastern State began. Finch's spirit, or something that wore his shape, became the prison's most infamous specter. His tall, shadowy figure is still seen standing in the central rotunda, gazing down the long, empty corridors. He is seen in the cells, a dark silhouette standing over the cots where inmates once slept, as if still watching, still judging. His presence is described as one of overwhelming authority and malevolence, a cold wave of despair that saps the will of anyone who feels it. He became the eternal warden of his own stone hell. Listen carefully, because this is crucial. The entity of Warden Finch is not a simple residual haunting. It is an active, intelligent force. Paranormal investigators who have spent the night there report equipment failure, disembodied commands to get out, and the distinct feeling of being watched by a hostile intelligence. Some have even captured electronic voice phenomena, a deep, cultured voice whispering phrases like "penance is eternal" and "silence will be observed." He is still enforcing his rules, still running his experiment, but now his subjects are not the living, but the trapped spirits of the men who died under his care. His most terrifying manifestation is said to occur in cell block 12, a place known for its extreme paranormal activity. There, a dark mass is often seen coalescing in the shape of a man, pacing back and forth, for hours on end. It is said that if you are the one to witness it, the figure will stop, turn, and its face, though featureless, will be directed at you. At that moment, You will be flooded with the emotions of every prisoner he ever tormented, the hopelessness, the terror, the rage, and the crushing weight of eternal judgment. It is an experience that has left grown men weeping in fear. The story of Warden Finch is a chilling reminder that the greatest monsters are often the ones who believe they are doing good. His fanaticism and lust for control twisted his faith into a dark parody, and in doing so, he damned not only his prisoners but himself. He wanted to create a place of perfect, silent order, and he succeeded. He is now the silent, orderly master of a kingdom of ghosts, forever trapped in the web of stone and misery that he designed. A testament to the fact that power, especially absolute power over the lives of others, is a door that often opens straight into hell. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Have you ever felt the cold gaze of an authority that seems to enjoy its power a little too much? This is the echo of Finch, a pattern of behavior that ripples through the history of control. The desire to break another's will is a dark magic in itself. Every soul that joins us helps to illuminate these shadows, to give voice to the warnings that history tries to bury. The whispers from the darkness grow stronger with every new listener who dares to tune in. Your subscription is your acknowledgement that you are not afraid to look into the abyss. Finally, we must speak of the guardians themselves, for not all guards are made of flesh. Let us travel to the desolate plains of Wyoming, to a frontier prison, long since abandoned to the wind and the dust. This prison was known for its brutality, a place where guards were often as criminal as the inmates. But one guard was different. His name was never recorded. He was known only as the Gray Man. He was a guard during the prison's early, most violent years, and he was known for his unyielding, silent presence. He never spoke, he never raised his voice, but his icy stare was enough to quell the most hardened criminals. The Gray Man had his own code of justice, one that was swift and merciless. An inmate who broke a rule, even a minor one, would find the Gray Man waiting for him in his cell that night. What happened next was never clear, as the victims were often left unable to speak of it, their minds shattered. But it was always bloodless, leaving no marks for the warden to investigate. The Gray Man seemed to have the ability to punish the soul directly, leaving the body as a mere shell. He was more feared than any shiv or beating, a silent, implacable specter of order. His end was a mystery. One day, he simply wasn't there. He didn't check out. He didn't collect his pay. His room in the barracks was empty, as if he had never existed. The inmates rejoiced, believing their tormentor was gone, but they were wrong. He had not left. He had merely integrated with the prison. His spirit became the ultimate enforcer. After his disappearance, inmates who broke the rules would still receive a visit. They would wake in the middle of the night to find a tall, gray, featureless figure standing in their cell, radiating an aura of profound cold and disappointment. And this is where the true horror manifests. The Gray Man's ghost was not just a passive observer. It actively participated in the prison's ecosystem of fear. If a fight was brewing, his figure would be seen standing in the corner of the yard, watching. If an inmate was planning an escape, they would see his gray form standing outside their window. A silent deterrent, he became a piece of the prison's own immune system, a spectral force that maintained the grim status quo. He wasn't interested in right or wrong, only in the cold, hard rules of the institution he served in life, and now in death. His legend grew over the decades. New inmates would be told the rules: don't gamble, don't steal, don't speak ill of the guards, and never ever whistle in the halls after dark. for that was a sound he particularly hated. Those who defied the warnings would learn the hard way. They might be locked in their cell and find the door impossible to open, even for the guards. They might have all their personal items vanish, only to reappear in a neat pile in the center of the floor, or in the worst cases, they would be found in the morning, huddled in a corner, their hair turned white, their eyes wide with a terror they could not articulate. What the whispers from beyond tell us is that some souls become so intertwined with a place or a purpose that they cannot leave. The gray man's entire identity was that of a prison guard. His sense of self was so rigid, so defined by his role, that death was not enough to release him from his duties. He is a type of entity known as a tutelary spirit, a guardian, but his charge is not the safety of people, but the sanctity of the rules themselves. He is the embodiment of order without mercy, of judgment without compassion, an automaton of punishment that will walk the halls for eternity. The prison is now a museum, a place for ghost tours and curious tourists, but the gray man is still on duty. Tour guides tell stories of groups feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill, of camera batteries draining in an instant, and of capturing a tall, smoky gray figure in photographs, standing in doorways or at the end of long corridors. He has been known to separate people from the group, causing them to get lost, only to be found later in a locked cell with no memory of how they got there. He is still enforcing the rules, and to him, everyone inside the walls is an inmate. This tale is not about a malevolent demon or a vengeful spirit. It is about something perhaps more unsettling, the ghost of bureaucracy, the specter of unthinking, unfeeling order. The gray man is a warning that systems of control can take on a life of their own, becoming forces that persist long after their human creators are gone. He is the chilling idea that the rules can become more important than the people they govern, a set of cold, dead instructions executed by a cold, dead guardian. A prison's purpose is to contain, and his spirit is the ultimate containment, a force that will never allow for parole. We have walked the darkest corridors tonight, from the haunted cells of the Jaw to the silent yard of Pelican Bay. We've stared into the cracked mirror of a madman's soul and played a hand with a cursed deck of cards. We've stood in the shadow of a warden who became a god in his own stone kingdom, and we've felt the cold stare of a guard who never clocks out. These are not just stories meant to frighten you. They are echoes from places where humanity is stripped away, where the veil between worlds is thin and frayed, worn down by the constant friction of suffering and despair. These places are alive, and they are hungry. The worst mistake you can make is believing that these walls, these shadows, are confined to the prisons we've discussed. They are not. The energy of these places leaks. The stories of these entities travel like a virus, carried by those who survive and those who investigate. The terror is not just in the experience, but in the telling of it. By listening to these words, you have opened a small creaking door in your own mind. You have invited a sliver of that cold, a faint echo of those whispers into your own safe space. The restlessness you may feel, the chill on your skin, that is the resonance of their reality touching yours. So as you turn off your screen and sit in the quiet of your room, listen past the hum of your refrigerator, past the distant sound of traffic. Listen to the silence and ask yourself, what gives it its shape? Is it truly empty, or is it merely waiting for you to pay attention? The horrors of the prison are not just about being locked in. They are about what can get in with you, and sometimes the door doesn't need a key. It just needs you to listen. This was not a lecture. This was an incantation, and now you are part of the circle until the next shadow falls upon us. Be wary of the silence. It is never truly empty.